So let's dig into some Q&A here. Some questions that we've been asked. You gonna kick this one off?
Yes, sir.
Ego Charles?
Yes, sir. Question number
What do you
one. First question. Jocko, as an aide de camp, what were your duties? What did you learn? And why does that position still exist in the 21st century military? What's an aide de camp?
Okay, so first of all, an aide de camp is something in the military that it's almost, I mean, to put it in a very simple way that people could understand it from, it's an assistant. It's like an executive assistant where, for me, I was the admiral that's in charge of all the SEALs. I was his assistant. You know, that's what an aide de camp is. Now, the question is, why does that position still exist, or what did you learn? Well, I learned a ton. No doubt about that. Why does the position still exist? I think it's absolutely necessary. It's not fun. It's not a fun job, and I work for a great guy. But if you're working for somebody that's not a great guy, it's miserable. And even working for a great guy, it's not exactly the dream job. It wasn't for me. So here's what you do. The boss, which is what we call, this is what we called the admiral. We called him the boss, right? So what I did was the boss is always traveling and going different places, going to the Pentagon, going to visit outstations, going overseas, just constantly going on travel and visiting people and visiting troops. And so I was the guy that set up that travel. That's what I did. I set up the travel, and then, communicating with wherever we were going to visit, like, hey, the admiral's coming in. What do you want us to do? Is there anything we need to be heads up on? So we'd take care of all that and set it up and make sure that the travel's smooth, because he's a really busy guy. It's like a CEO. He's like the CEO of a big, giant, powerful worldwide company. That's what he is. And so you're trying to make the most of his time, make sure not wasting his time during travel. And so that's what I did. So that's part of it. And the other piece that's cool is you're kind of like a trusted advisor, or you try and build the trust so that he trusts you. And they usually, in our case, often try to find guys that had come back from the front lines and use them as the aide. And so when I became the aide, it was actually my commanding officer. Who's a friend of mine and who's a great guy that always took care of me, and he told me, he said, hey, my final mission as the commanding officer of SEAL Team 7 is to make sure that you become the aide to the admiral. And I wasn't happy about it, because again, it's an administrative job. You have to wear a uniform every day.
When was this?
2005.
Okay.
And but it was a good call that my commanding officer made me go do it, because I did learn a ton. I've been in the micro world of being in a SEAL platoon for my whole life, right? So that's all I did, and so I didn't know anything else. I didn't understand anything else. So you go, all of a sudden you're dealing with, not only do you see the big picture of the SEAL teams, but I saw the big picture of the Army and the Special Operations Command and big Navy, like the regular Navy. We interacted with them a lot. So I got to learn a ton. I learned a ton about what I learned. It's sort of like seeing behind the curtain. You get to see behind the curtain of the wizard and what's going on in the chambers, and basically, like how they make the sausage. Have you ever heard that term? No. They say when they make sausage, like, you'll eat the sausage, it tastes good, but you don't want to see how they make it.
Yeah.
So I got to see how they make the sausage. I got to see behind the curtain, and I learned a ton of that. I got to sit, like, there was meetings that I would sit in, super high level meetings with very powerful people in the meetings, and I would just be sitting there listening and seeing how these judgments were being made and assessing the leadership and seeing what type of leaders we had at the highest levels of the Pentagon, and so it was pretty interesting, and I definitely learned a lot. It was not fun because, like I said, there was a ton of travel. You're wearing a uniform all the time, which SEALs are pretty well known for not wanting to wear uniforms, real uniforms, and I'd probably worn a uniform a very small number of times. I'm talking my whole naval career, a dress uniform. I'd probably worn one 15 times.
Yeah.
I don't know the number, but it's a tiny number.
Right.
And all of a sudden, I'm working for the Admiral. I'm wearing a uniform every single day. And there were sometimes we'd go on a trip and I'd have to wear, there's multiple different dress uniforms in the Navy and in most of the services. Yeah. We'd go on some where I'd have to bring 2 or 3 different dress uniforms. So my uniforms were always ready. That was one thing that not too many people could claim, is you get really good at your uniforms. But there's also some things that are pretty restrictive. Like, for instance, you're actually not allowed to do personal favors for the boss. Like, I wasn't allowed, because this idea, because they're very cautious that the military senior people might abuse people in the military.
Oh, yeah.
And, like, I wasn't allowed. For instance, I wasn't allowed to go pick up his laundry. Like, if he got his uniforms pressed and clean, right, I wasn't allowed to go and run to the store and pick it up if we were going on a trip or something. Like, he wasn't allowed to do it. Huh. We weren't allowed to fly first class. There was only one time we flew first class. That was we get upgrades after a while because we were traveling so much. But
so both you guys couldn't, or just the aide de camp?
No, neither one of us. We wouldn't fly first class.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's the military sort of. They don't want there to be fraud, waste, and abuse.
Yeah.
Which is actually ridiculous. This guy's the equivalent of a CEO of a big company, and they wouldn't get the guy first class tickets to fly from San Diego to Washington D.C. to go to the Pentagon and brief some senior governmental leadership.
Yeah, fully. That's a good philosophy, though. The no waste thing.
Yeah, I know it's a good philosophy, but they should have. I think he'd earned it at that point.
Right.
30-something years in the Navy.
Yeah, for that
serving his country
waste,
and just to be, hey, you know what? This guy should be well rested when he shows up to brief Congress.
Yeah. Fully.
So that was that. And then the reason I think it's necessary, again, is because you take a guy, the admiral, they're not going to usually or often may not have been in recent combat situations. And so this aide that's coming in, he's coming off the battlefield. So he can say, hey, sir, here's what's going on here. Hey, sir, this is what this is like. Hey, sir, this is some gear that we need up on the front lines. Hey, sir, this is what the frontline troopers think about this program that we're doing, or this rule that's being imposed upon us. We need to change this, or we need to get it fixed. So I had a great relationship with the boss when I was running that job, and it was very beneficial for me on my next deployment when I deployed to Ramadi, and I knew the admiral. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was, he's the guy that's in charge of all SEALs. Mm-hmm. And there I was in Ramadi, and, there was times where we talked directly, he'd call me up and say, hey, what's going on? Or, after my guys got killed, he called me up directly. And that really meant a lot to me. And I think it meant a lot to him too, because he had a connection with the guys that were out there, because he knew me and knew me well. So I think that was very important, and I think it's a good job. I'm not going to say you're going to like it. If there's troopers out there that are up for that job, you're not going to like it. If you're a hardcore getting after it kind of guy, you're not going to like the job. The people that actually, and the scary thing is, the people that volunteer and want to have that job are usually the guys the admirals don't want, because that's a guy that's like focused on advancing his career. And hey, if I can be an aide, then I'll know the admiral. And so you're not gonna. Those are the guys the admirals actually. At least the admiral I work for, he didn't want any guys like that. He wanted guys that were gonna say, "Oh, I want a guy that's gonna come kicking and screaming to this job."
Yeah.
Because he doesn't want to wear a uniform. He wants to be in the field. I want to be in the field.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the aide de camp. So if there's a trooper out there that's going to get pushed in that position, you might have to do it. And when you do it, you do the best that you can. Yeah. When the guy that took over for me, he said, because I was, I've always been early to work. Well, when I was working for the boss, I was even earlier, because this is, I felt this responsibility that, I got to take care of this guy. He's taking care of all the SEALs. I got to take care of him, right? This guy, the easier I make his job, the easier I make his life, the more he can focus on taking care of all the guys that are in the field and all the SEALs. And so when I would show up even earlier than I would normally show up, and I was double and triple and quadruple check everything that was going on. And when the guy came to relieve me and take my place, and he said, you know, hey, how does the boss react if you drop the ball on something? And I said, I don't know. I didn't drop the ball. I mean, that was, you know, a lot of luck involved, and I had some other guys that were with me that really helped me out. You know, one guy in particular is a civilian guy that is steady, has always worked there for a long time, and he was always covering my tracks and helped me not drop the ball. But I never dropped the ball.
Yeah. It's kind of a good answer, though, to that question. Like, because, you know, if you were like, oh, hey, well, he doesn't take it so hard, almost like that might plant something in his mind where it may not be as important every single time or something like that. Yeah, no,
it's important every time. You can't drop the ball.
Yeah.
You got to keep it going.
Is it ever viewed by people or whatever that job's like kind of emasculating or something? Because you're like an assistant more so than the, you know.
I don't know. Maybe somebody views it that way.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm a military guy that got tasked with a job to take care of the senior SEAL officer and keep his day moving so that he can take care of the troops. I think that's beneficial.
Right.
I didn't feel that way. And the other thing is, you're not allowed to do certain things.
Well,
you're not allowed to do personal things for him.
Right.
And even and the guy that I work for was very laid back. And, I mean, and part of the reason he was laid back was because I never dropped the ball for him.
Right.
I wouldn't want to drop the ball because I'm sure he would be angry.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it wasn't a bad job.
Yeah, I would think if you understand the value of the job, really understand the value of a job, you probably will never really feel emasculated or anything.
No.
But I think, you know, sometimes some of us can go into jobs and be like, you know, I'm a leader, I'm not a helper, you know, kind of attitude.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too, because when you're working for the admiral, then when you speak, you kind of speak for the admiral. So in other words, when I'd go in to talk to some senior captains and I said, hey, can I get a copy of XYZ?
Right.
They knew it wasn't me that wanted it. They knew it was the boss that wanted it.
Right.
So people are snapping too. So it was interesting from that perspective. Even though I was a young lieutenant at the time, I'd go in and say, hey, can we get this? We need this report. And the guys would be like jumping too, like full captains would be jumping too, because they knew that it wasn't for me, and they respected the boss and they wanted to help him out. So it was you get a little bit of added weight because people know, especially because people kind of knew we had a good relationship, and so they knew that if I was asking for something or I needed something or I was suggesting something, they knew where it was coming from. They knew it was coming from the big boss man. So
it's kind of like the executive assistant to like Oprah or something.
Well, look, no.
All right, there you go.
We're not going to talk about the person that you just talked about on this podcast. It's not happening.
All right, gotcha.
Error.
I'm just saying, you know, if you go around and you're like, hey, I need...
I would say it would be the equivalent of being the executive assistant to a very powerful CEO that has a lot of stress and decisions to make and has a large global corporation under their command.
Actually, that kind of reminds me of the whole flying first class thing. And I thought about this where there was a big part of me that thought, oh, yeah, a lot of guys, they'll just fly first class just because that's like a status thing. And like, oh, yeah, I'm this high, so I get to kind of live in this luxury. But flying first class eliminates a lot of stress and a lot of like decision making and headaches. You know, we're contending with certain things.
Yeah.
So when you arrive, you have way less on your mind. So, and that's a lot. You ever had to do something or convey some important message, but you have a lot on your mind, some other stuff. It makes it way harder.
Yeah. Then I just prioritize and execute.
Right.
Go forward.
I know, but it has its function, is what I'm saying.
It does. It does. And there was the time literally the one time we were authorized and executed a first class travel was when we flew to Europe, and when we arrived at 6 o'clock in the morning, the boss, or 7 o'clock in the morning, the boss was talking to the troops a half an hour later. And then the whole day was scheduled out talking to the local senior leadership. So he needed to be rested when he showed up there.
Yeah.
Now, me, on the other hand, if I remember correctly, I was in the cheap seats.
But you don't really need that much
Yeah,
rest.
because,
So,
hey,
man.
young lieutenant can just suck it up. Because it is pretty pathetic. We're sitting here talking about first class. You know what? Let's just talk about Bob Hoffman. Do you know what I mean? World War I, trench warfare.
Yeah,
I don't think he was too worried about flying first class.
Yeah,
to
and
France.
he had a lot of decisions to make.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So let's just suck it up.
Suck it up. All right. Next question.